Thank you very much. Please welcome Dr. Liana Saif.
Thank you. That's all. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Taro Mimura for organizing this lecture. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here to talk about magic with everyone. I would also like to thank the members of our Kaken team for their support, amazing support, and for being so welcoming to my work and being so welcoming in Japan. Thank you very much. I really, really appreciate it. So the subject that I'm going to talk about is the overview of magical traditions in the Islamicate world. So it's a very diverse tradition. There isn't one tradition. So I just want to talk about today the different traditions, the principles that make these traditions, and what kind of texts represent these traditions. So the content will be, first of all, I would like to talk about the place of magic in the classifications of knowledge in medieval Islam. So what do I mean when I say magic in that context is important to define. And then I'm going to talk about 5 types, let's say, of magic, although they are very much connected, as I will show. The first is astral magic. The second is what we can call hermetic magic, under the name also Hermeticism. And another type is a Hermeticism Islamicized, and then Solomonic magic, and finally a quick reference to the science of letters and divine names, which is a magical tradition that takes off in the early modern period in Islam, and I will be focusing more on the medieval traditions. So the word in Arabic for magic in general, but not exclusively, is sihr. Magic in Arabic is sihr. And magic belongs to the kind of knowledge that was referred to as hikmah, which is wisdom traditions. So this involves observations of nature, but also philosophy and metaphysics, magic, and the occult sciences. And at the core of the meaning of magic in that context is action at a distance. How can I make something, create a powerful object that fulfills my needs, but have powers that transmit to the subject of my needs? So it is a kind of action at a distance. Sometimes, but not always, it involves invocations of planetary powers, of angels and spirits. So in general, when I'm talking about magic in the medieval period, this is the kind of context that I am referring to. And it's important to understand that magic in this context is not marginal. It's not weird. It's actually part of the classification of knowledge that we find in very mainstream philosophers, like the famous philosopher Ibn Sina. So what you can see here is a scheme of the classifications of knowledge that Ibn Sina gives in his Aqsam al-Ulum al-Aqliya, the classifications of intellectual sciences. And as you will see, the occult sciences, astrology, physiognomy, oneiromancy, so in general, divination, astrology, magic, and alchemy, including medicine, sometimes considered an occult science, they fall under secondary natural sciences. Why? The primary natural sciences, according to Ibn Sina, are the more abstract sciences like natural philosophy, metaphysics. So understanding the cosmology, right? So understanding Aristotelian principles of causes, form, matter, etc. So these are abstract, these are very philosophical. But the secondary sciences, the occult sciences here, they are these sciences in practice. So they're called secondary because you take all this abstract material and abstract knowledge from the primary natural sciences and you put it in action, you put it in practice. So you have medicine, astrology, magic, divination, and alchemy. So this is where it sits in mainstream philosophical scheme of knowledge. And so the first type I want to talk about, which is the earliest type of magic that we see promoted heavily in medieval Islam, and this is called astral magic. If you read a lot of the texts that I'm going to mention, you'll find that astral magic is described as taking the powers of the celestial world, tying them with terrestrial objects. So it's bringing the celestial world to the terrestrial world. So from stars to Earth. And one of the earliest texts that we have that describe astral magic is in the work of Thabit ibn Qurra called On Talismans. And this book starts with a very influential sentence that I will read for you because it's very important. Thabit ibn Qurra said, notice Aristotle is an authority on magic here because, as I said, it's secondary natural philosophy. So it is not surprising to find Aristotle in a text on magic. So Thabit ibn Qurra said, Aristotle said, whoever reads philosophy and geometry and every science and is devoid of astronomy will be occupied and empty, since the most worthy geometry and the highest philosophy is the science of talismans. And you can see here a kind of talismanic inscription. And talismans is a magical object, in general made of metal, that corresponds to the stars astrologically, and images are inscribed on it that have astrological themes. So perhaps here, we don't know for sure, but we can see a Scorpio, and we can see what seems to be a bull, and 3 stars. So it must be representing some sort of astrological signs or configurations. Most likely, this is an example of a talisman that was used to protect from the sting of scorpions. And of course, in the context of medieval Islam in the 8th century, that was a big concern. People were worried to get stung by scorpions, so you find a lot of talismans for this type of purpose. And now the philosopher, I continue, has said, the second treatise of his book, that just as there is no motion to a body lacking a soul, nor life for an animate body except through the food by which its natures are directed and made sound. So there is no light of wisdom when astronomy has been taken away, which is a fancy way of saying there is no astral magic without astrology. The astral influences give life to a dead object. So the talisman is just a metal with figures, but the celestial influences give this talisman life. It gives this talisman form, it gives it agency, it gives it power, right? And here's another example of that same talisman, but actually the object itself. So this is the mold, and this is the talisman. We don't know if they are connected, but you can see how it would have looked like in the past. And one of the most representative books in medieval Islam of the tradition of astral magic is, I'm sure some of you already know this book. It's Maslam al-Majliti's Ghayat al-Hakim, known as the Picatrix, and it was written in the 10th century. Here, Maslam al-Majliti writes, know this and consider what Thabit ibn Qurra stated in his treatise on talismans. So it's what we read earlier. the most venerable part of astrology is the science of talismans. So the most important part of astrology is making talismans, because you're putting it in practice. That's the most important thing. How to use this material for our lives. The most venerable part of astrology is the science of talismans. He also claimed that there is no life in a body without a soul in it. By this he meant that the talismans made in accordance with astrological ratios, other than those from which the effects are desired, becoming unreceptive to the emanations of the planetary ruhaniyat, spirits, which I will talk about a little later. Such an object is like dead bodies which have no souls. So if the body, the talisman, is not specifically tying the purpose, so your purpose, what you want to protect yourself from the sting of the scorpion, you have to probably address or look for Scorpio in the sky. Otherwise, the object is dead. But if you tie the astrological correspondence to the material, then the object is alive. And I want to draw attention to this picture because it's very rare, very, very rare, that we are able to see objects that match a text. Very lucky that we do have this text, دقائق الحقائق, the finer points of truth, which is a 13th century text where we have this image, which is familiar to us now. We have the scorpion, and here we have a lion, and the 3 stars and some scripts. Now, we don't know if the person who made this read this. It's unlikely because this is very old. This is 10th century, and it's very rare to have 10th century objects because they're made of metal. And what happens to metal? Breaks down and corrodes with time. This is earlier, but it's interesting that we find a textual evidence of that particular image. And so, the foundations of astral magic is the following. No magic without astrology, and in this case, classical astrology. No magic without ruhaniyat. And ruhaniyat are spiritual forces. They're not spirits like jinn or demons or yokai or something like that. They are powers, celestial powers. So to do astral magic, you need to connect with these powers, with these agents that deliver the influence, right? And finally, talismans are artificial but living objects. No magic without astrology, no magic without ruhaniyat, and the talisman is a body made alive. I want to share some of these texts that represent the tradition of astral magic. We read Thabit ibn Qurra already. I will talk about the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica in a bit. There's, of course, the Jabirian corpus, which a lot of our researchers in alchemy recognize, the name Geber, Jabir ibn Hayyan. And other texts like Sirr al-Khaliqa by Pseudo-Apollonius, Ibn Wahshiyya, Al-Filah al-Nabatiyya, and other Arabic materia, magica, and stone magic. So these are good representatives of that tradition. Which leads me to the second point, or the second type, if you will, Hermeticism. And Hermeticism is difficult to define, but to make it simpler for our purposes, you can consider it the occult and esoteric knowledge attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, who is a legendary Greco-Egyptian sage to whom many texts are attributed in the Arabic world regarding magic, astrology, and astrological influences. But what is Hermeticism really? This is a very controversial subject. Does Hermeticism exist? And the answer to this question has been first addressed by my colleague Kevin Van Bledo, who wrote the first book to explore Hermes in the Arabic context, in the medieval period in particular. The name of the book is The Arabic Hermes, From Pagan Sage to Prophet of Science. It's a wonderful book. I highly encourage reading it to understand how the Hermetic material perhaps circulated in the Islamic context. But he makes a very important conclusion, and I will read it out. I have not found any such reflection on Arabic Hermeticism. Moreover, in the context of Arabic literature, modern scholars generally use the word Hermetic to refer not to just works associated with the name of Hermes, but also to all manner of works with allegedly Gnostic, Neoplatonic, Neo-Pythagorean, or esoteric tendencies. So what he is saying that, and it's true, a lot of scholars who studied this material would label something Hermetic if it had magic, if it had astrology, if it had Neoplatonism, if it had Neo-Pythagoreanism. But this is not so accurate. So, above all, it is used to refer to the beliefs of the Sabians of Harran. So the Sabians of Harran are a community of monotheists who lived probably in the southern regions of today's Turkey, who were monotheists, but they revered the planets, and so they had temples, and some of which you can actually see to this day if you visit Harran. So that's another problem. A lot of people, a lot of scholars, just because the Sabians of Harran revere the planets, people just decided or made the judgment that that must be Hermetic. But Kevin Van Bladel in this book rightly challenges that, because we have no evidence of how they identify. We don't have Sabian texts. We have later texts, not by them, that were described as Sabian and Hermetic, but we want to go further. We need to see their own sources to be able to make that judgment. And so he concludes, Kevin concludes, the term Hermetism did not exist in Arabic literature. Other terms and criteria appropriate to this context are needed and remain to be determined. To move forward, one must discard all of the assumptions commonly made in modern scholarship and rely as much as possible on primary sources, so original sources in their original languages. Not to talk vaguely about Hermeticism, but to study the Arabic Hermetica themselves and relevant works contemporary with them. And that's what I tried to do. So, to do this, I became very interested in then what can we call Hermeticism? And we are very lucky because we have a group of texts that are called the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. What does that mean? They are 9th century Arabic texts that take the form of letters or exchanges between Aristotle and Alexander the Great. And here Aristotle is giving advice to Alexander the Great before his campaigns to Persia and India, etc. And the content involves magic, medicine, but also cosmology, rituals, astrological correspondences, etc. And it's not just one text. We have several texts that seem to have traveled together, and they have these very bizarre names that sound like fake Greek. So, Al-Istimachis, Al-Istimatis, Haditus, Al-Istuatas, Al-Maditis, and don't ask me what they mean, I do not know. But also there are other texts like Kitab al-Shu'ara al-Yamaniya, which is the book that deals with the astrological configuration of al-Shu'ara al-Yamaniya, and the Khirat Iskandar, the Treasury of Alexander, which is a very popular book of magic that later was translated into Persian, and to this day we see a copy of it. And this image is from one manuscript of the Khirat Iskandar. So, I wanted decided to take the challenge that Kevin Van Bladel offers in his book. Can we look at this corpus and find any coherence, any things that links them together, enough for us to call them Arabic Hermeticism? Let's look at some of the traits of this corpus. Now, some of the manuscripts or some of the texts, do you remember those texts? Some of them seem to travel together constantly in manuscript form. So for example, Al-Istimachis, Al-Istimatis, Al-Istotas, and other texts seem to have been gathered together as a corpus, and we see this in manuscript in Oxford, Bodleian, Arab D221, and another manuscript in the British Library in the Delhi Arabic Collection, 1940-50. So the fact that they historically traveled together is one sign of that coherence. What else? The second thing that we should look for is cross-references. Do these texts refer to each other? Is there a continuation of the themes in these? And what we find is that that is correct. That's exactly what you find. These texts constantly refer to each other, and some of them even indicate which came first. The Istimachis was the first one, and then Alexander the Great asked another question, and so Al-Istimatis was then written. So they seem to be a connected corpus. What about the content is just as important. And here is what we find the really interesting material. Because if you read the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, what you will find is that there is a unique mythology and cosmology, very unique to itself. So we have emphasis on cosmological cycles. So for example, their astrological, the years of the Libra and the significance of their revolutions, but also astrological conjunctions and what happens when they come again. So the idea of the cycle is very, very important. Now the second interesting context that you find in all these sources is the story of the creation of humans. So we know the story of Adam and Eve, but here we have an alternative, a different version that is very interesting, and it involves a demiurge, so it involves a creating entity, not just the one God, but an entity that seems to create Adam and Eve. And his name is Hadus, and he's a kind of great spirit, but the text doesn't tell you exactly what his role is, but Hadus is also a power that is ordained by God. So it's not that he acts in opposition to a principle of light like we see in Zoroastrianism. He's an agent of God. And you see references to Hadus and the knowledge that he gives to Adam in all of these texts. So we have consistency. We also have a discourse about prophets, a kind of sage prophets representing the different planets. So the prophet of Saturn, who gives humanity laws, who gives humanity knowledge related to Saturn, magic related to Saturn, and then after that Jupiter, a sage of Jupiter. So basically these are men that get possessed by these ruhaniya, these spirits, in I think a cycle of 1,000 years, 7 times. So 7,000 for 1,000 for each planet. And the fourth principle that we see in the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica is what I refer to as volitional causality. So volitional causality means a kind of order, causal order in the universe, but it's not mechanic. It's not like a clock. It's run by forces that enact God's will, like Hadus, like the Ruhaniyat. And finally, the book is that these texts are filled to the brim with magical practice, talismans, niranj, invocation, and astrological rules. Niranj is a type of magic, and the word niranj actually comes from Middle Persian, And in the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, these are objects not made with metal, but organic material, and they're supposed to attract the spirits of animals or something else, but they're made of organic material, therefore almost impossible to survive because they break down so quickly. So, as a result of my studies, I recently published an article called A Preliminary Study of the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, Text, Context, and Doctrines. And this is the conclusion that I arrived after my preliminary study, and I hope to study it some more with the help of this grant particularly. And this is my conclusion. The philosophical rationale for the connection between the macrocosm, so the big universe, and the microcosm, the human, place the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica firmly within the pseudo-Aristotelian genre. The magical and theurgic elements are supported by the astrologization of Aristotelian causality via the reconciliation of Aristotle and Hermes. Did you notice that Aristotle was mentioned a lot? So when you bring Aristotle and you bring Hermes together, you have the pseudo-Aristotelian cosmology. The astrologization of Aristotelian causality via the reconciliation of Aristotle and Hermes, whose works are presented as the source of the former's knowledge. So Aristotle in the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica claims that this knowledge that he has received from Hermes Trismegistus, from works of Hermes Trismegistus. That's why we call him the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. The content is thus, in this sense, hermetic. I believe that because of this, we can actually call it hermetic. But this does not imply that the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica embody a trans-historical body of fixed dogma, or a set of doctrines uniting text and thinkers in various languages across time and space under the anachronistic rubric of Hermeticism, which means that indeed we cannot say like Islam, Christianity, Hermeticism. We don't have dogmatic set of beliefs and texts, and we don't really understand how these texts circulated. So in that sense, we cannot consider Hermeticism a religion. So this does not imply that the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica embody a trans-historical body of fixed dogma or a set of doctrines uniting text and thinkers in various languages across time and space under the rubric of Hermeticism, as Bladel insists. Nonetheless, the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica do constitute a substantial body of text with a thematic and mythic consistency that lends itself to the construction of a medieval Arabic Hermeticism, constructed not by people who we know call their religion Hermeticism, but by medieval agents as filling the pages of Hermetic books. So if we want to talk about Arabic Hermeticism, we are talking about the way the Arabs in the medieval period understood the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, which had this consistency. And I think that warrants for us to see Arabic Hermeticism, especially that they were so influential. So here we find the influence of the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. If you see Ruhaniyat and their invocation, that could mean pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. Astrological correspondences, lunar mansions, occult properties of natural things, magical practices. These are the subjects that filter the influence of the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. And we find it in Ghayat al-Hakim, the Picatrix, in the works of Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity, who were a secret underground group of esotericists, and Ibn al-Arabi, the famous Sheikh Sufi of Al-Andalus, the Neo-Ikhwan al-Safa, who were an early modern group of occultists that identified as the new Ikhwan al-Safa, and Ahmed al-Buni, who was a Sufi and became known for his work on what I will refer to later as a magic like Kabbalah, called the science of letters and divine names. So the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica are super important to how we understand the occult sciences in medieval Islam and early modern Islam as well. So, just to sum up, what are the features of Arabic Hermeticism? First, there's that causality and relationship between the world above and the world below. The world above causes the world below, but also the world above gives us signs about the links between the world above and the world below. Arabic Hermeticism involves very complex astrology, very complex. The other thing is that the human soul potential for tapping into the powers. So the human has this potential to be able to use the powers of the stars. Number 4, the ruhaniyat. They always appear. And the ruhaniyat, as I said, are celestial agents. They are not jinn, they are not angels, and they are not demons, they're agents. You always find description also of natural occult properties. So description of the properties of plants, of minerals, of stones. Also the ability to harness celestial powers in objects. So you always have an object that you harness the power and give it life, as we said earlier. Sometimes, often, you will have planetary rituals. So invocation, incenses, and creating a space that is full of astrological power. And then attribution to Aristotle, Hermes, and sometimes Apollonius. But the ultimate textual reference is, of course, the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. So that is what I refer to as Arabic Hermeticism. And one thing that is interesting about this text is, as I said, it has an alternative mythology. We cannot really call it Islamic, as in like it doesn't contain elements that we can call it belonging to the Islamic group or Muslim group. But because of its influence, we see that it actually becomes more explicitly Islamicized, okay? Islamicized, as we move towards the 12th century in particular. So we start reading texts where instead of ruhaniyat, we have angels now. Now we have the jinn, the jinn like the creatures that are mentioned in the Quran who are invisible to humans and live in another dimension, so to speak. So very Quranic. Now we have the jinn. What's strange is that from complex astrology becomes very elementary, in fact, basic. Now we also have reference to the Quran. In the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, the references to the Quran are very, I would say, non-existent, but sometimes you find it in some texts introduced by the scribe. So the person who wrote down these manuscripts would write things like Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and things like that. But in general, there's no Quran. Towards the 12th century, that type of magic, now we have Quran, and particularly the genre of khawas al-Quran. And this is a genre that describes the qualities of verses of the Quran for all types of reasons, like healing, like even getting love, etc. The demiurge completely disappears, so we don't see hadus. And it makes sense because the idea of the demiurge is problematic in the Islamic context. We don't have anymore these sages, those astral prophets that I talked about that come every 1,000 years. They turn from astral sages to the prophets that we know, Moses, Jesus, etc., and the imams in the Shia context. And finally, we start having a kind of like letrist association. And what I mean by that is that in the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, the correspondences are usually astrological, plants, minerals, and animals, and diseases or purpose or intention in general. Towards the 12th century, we start having the letters in a Kabbalistic sort of way, if you will. So, to give you an example of this kind of Islamicization, I will look at, take a look together at a book by Siraj ad-Din al-Sakkaki, who is a grammarian and occultist in the 12th century approximately. And this book is called Al-Kitab al-Shamil fil Bahr al-Kamil, and me and Dr. Tarbi Mora are in a similar collaborators in a project at Exeter that deals particularly with this text, and they are translating it and studying this text. And here we start seeing something different happen with that Hermeticism. We start see a reorientation from Hermetic to Solomonic and Jewish material. So, to give you an example, how you can see that in this text. So, the first quote, by these 7 signs are driven off corrupting beasts and corrupting birds. By the names of these mighty signs which Moses, peace be upon him, prayed with, I say to you, O beasts, O birds, you shall disperse from the plants of this town and do them no harm, as long as these 7 signs are inscribed here. So this seems to be an operation that seeks to push away vermin and push away hurtful animals to crops or a town. But the language is very different. It's not naturalistic, and now we have references to Moses. In the second example, so it's a Solomonic protective formula and invocation, and you don't find this kind of invocation in the Pseudo-Assyrian Hermetica. I conjure you by the robe of Adam, by the crown of Eve, by the book of Seth, by the ascension of Enoch, by the ark of Noah, etc., etc., by David and Saul, by King Solomon, by the wisdom of Luqman, by the message of Elijah, etc., etc., the staff of Moses, Jesus' sign. So again, we see a more Solomonic language, and instead of the sages, now we have the prophets. But what do we mean by Solomonic magic? What is Solomonic magic in the Arabic context? We know Solomonic magic in the European context, which is a Latin European tradition that evolved in the 12th and 13th century. It's Christian, very Christian, with non-Christian roots, particularly ancient Greek and Jewish. And there we find the influence of texts like the Liber Razialis. It's pseudo-epigraphic, so it's not, of course, works by actually Solomon. And it's represented by 3 major texts that are very well known, the Ars Notoria and the Liber Eurotis Honori and the Almadel tradition. And it has particular characteristics. So the goal of it is power in knowledge and intellectual enlightenment. It requires inner discipline and purity. And it contains invocations of angels and Christian prayers to God, very complicated rituals, and has complex figures for contemplation. So there's these sigils that you have to contemplate to be able to perform Solomonic magic. But in the Islamic context, we do not have this clear tradition. But what we seem to have is, during that phase that I talked about, towards the 12th century and on, we start getting a very explicitly Jewish content in Islamic magic. For example, here you see in this manuscript a Metatron. And Metatron is an angel in Judaism mentioned in the Talmud, and the name that Enoch received after becoming an angel. And we find this in this beautiful manuscript. It's a Seljuk manuscript, so 13th century, and it contains such images that are so beautiful, but a pronounced Hebraic content that we don't see in astro magic, and we don't see in the Pseudo-Assyrian Hermetica. And during that period, we start having authors of magic explicitly saying that this type of magic is in way religious, and they start distinguishing between the different types of magic. One that is more confessional, so it has more traditional religious element, and they refer to it as another kind of magic. And we see that in another famous grimoire by Fakhruddin al-Razi. So again, mainstream philosophers we're talking about. And he refers to this Hebraic magic, Hebraic Islamic magic, as another kind of magic. And it's a kind of angelic magic, if you wish. And he even writes, and you can see the shift, right, from ruhaniyat to angels. He writes, religions agree, al-adyan, religions agree that celestial spirits take care of administering all types of events in this world. These spirits, arwah, are called in the language of religion, shara. So it's explicit, the Islamicization, explicit, really. And these spirits are called in the language of religion, shara, angels. It was mentioned in the Quran, so now it's placed firmly in the Islamic context. And one of the very interesting aspects of that text is that there is these verses in the Quran, short verses, that have these terms that have been subjected to a lot of exegesis because it's not sure what they mean. And these are Safat, Zajirat, and it seems these are quite significant terms. But Fakhruddin al-Razi now refers to Safat as angels of Saturn, the Zajirat as angels of Mars. So we have a sort of exegesis here, an occult exegesis, which is very interesting. So becomes firmly Islamicized and firmly religified here. So, what is this angelic magic? What is the traits of this tradition of magic, this Solomonic Dash angelic? It's astral magic meets angelic and jinn magic. They be confused. There's a lot of references still to the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. So we find astrological elements like the lunar mansions that are very prominent in the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, which also Dr. Tara Mumira is studying, the lunar mansions. And finally, we have the Jewish element. So we start having formulae like, I swear upon you, you who are inclined to become obedient by he who revealed the Torah on Moses, son of Amram, Adonai, Zabwat, El Shaddai. So even the expressions are Hebrew expressions. And that would be this type of Solomonic angelic magic. These are, the problem with studying this genre of magic is that we haven't yet done research on what Solomonic magic means in Islam. Is there such a thing? There's a lot to be done yet, and I encourage, if you find it interesting, talk to me. I would love to encourage you to do research on the subject because, again, this is an area that has not been studied much. But if we are going to look at the traits that I gave earlier in some texts, we will find them in texts like the one on top, Kitab al-Riyush al-Babili, and another one in Uyun Haqa'iq wa Idah al-Dara'iq. I don't want to overwhelm you with Arabic titles, but these are the kind of texts that would have Hebrew formulas like Adonai Sabuat, referencing to Solomon, and the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, but we need a lot more work to understand what that means. And so, in the 12th century and the 13th century, these are the traits, the major traits of that tradition. Astral magic becomes more confessional, Jewish, Islamic, and Hermetic. Jinn and demons become the magical agents with the ruhaniyat. Before, it was just the ruhaniyat and they were not spirits. They were celestial influences that were multiplication of the universal soul. And it is this 12th century Hebraic, Solomonic, Islamicized Hermeticism is not Sufi, so it's not related to Sufism directly, but often is informed by Sufism. And from that very Islamicized magic, we step into the final type of magic, which I will not talk too much about because that takes us outside the early modern period. But this final type is called lettrist magic. And this is based on an exegetical, esoteric, magical science called the science of letters and divine names. So if you want something that resembles it, it's kind of, you you can think of the Kabbalah, for example. The letters of the Arabic abjad is seen as the building blocks of the universe. God creates things through his divine names and through his letters. And so it's a Sufi occult science, because if you know the letters and you know how to manipulate, if you know the letters well, then you can manipulate reality and produce effect. And the kind of magical elements that you see are magical squares, like the one on the top to the left. You see the square, that's a magic square with numbers, but also you see invocations of divine figures like Ya Ali. Imam Ali is referenced here. And we see also a lot of letters and symbols. This is a very famous symbol called this basically the symbols of God's greatest name. And this is very also prominent in letters magic. So less astrology. You don't see astrology on this compared to the other talisman that we saw that had astrological figures. And I will leave you with that as the final type of magic. Thank you so much for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much, Liana. Can we see the types of the magic in
Tell me which one? Tell me when to stop.
This is the beginning, yes. Yes, thank you very much. Yes. So you mean the type 5, the science of the letters, then we're going to the early modern age?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it begins to flourish in the 12th century, really, but really picks up also in the early modern period. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. So we have time to discussion, question and answer. Do you have any question? Mimura-san, Taro.
Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I'm very interested in the Aristotelian Hermetica because this is the package of Aristotle and Hermes, but the contents is not so brief. So why they need the name of Hermes and Aristotle for circulating this kind of talismanic word?
This is a very important question. So if I understand your question correctly, it's why do they need Hermes and Aristotle when Aristotle has never written anything? I think it's a combination of things. Legitimacy. If you say it's Aristotle, you give it a kind of legitimacy, but also the content a little bit. So in one of the texts, Al-Isturtas, there's the first small part of this text is talking about the four causes, the Aristotelian four causes, the formal, the material, the teleological, and the efficient. And so it actually explains the astrological influences in very Aristotelian terms, I think. So although the texts don't have a lot of theory, but the theory that you find is typical Abu Ma'shar type of astrologized Aristotle. So in that sense, it makes sense. Hermes, because Aristotle is saying that his knowledge is coming from Hermes. And this would also add legitimacy to the material, that this is coming from someone divinely inspired, such as Hermes Trismegistus. I think when the reference to Hermes Trismegistus is also an invention, as you know. I don't think that Hermes Trismegistus actually wrote the books that Aristotle read, but that's why I think we can talk about Arabic Hermeticism, because Arabic Hermeticism will then refer to Hermes when they're talking about astrological correspondences, ruhaniya, talisman making. So I think as a constructed tradition, this is to give legitimacy, but also the theories underlying it, like the macrocosm and the microcosm, is very Hermetic dash Neoplatonic. And Aristotle, because of the causality and legitimacy. makes sense. This is legitimate because it's Aristotle and it is Hermes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Aristotle and Hermes are for them authority. Yes, authority of their knowledge of existence. So they call or Hermes or Aristotle.
Exactly. And also in the Arabic tradition, when you read texts that say the wise man or the philosopher or al-hakim, it can mean two people only, either Aristotle or Hermes. Yeah, because remember I was talking about the wisdom tradition that magic belongs to? The main authorities in that wisdom tradition would be Hermes, Aristotle, and of course Apollonius and others, but at the top would be Aristotle and Hermes.
Thank you. ではまず最初順番からごめんなさい、リュウさんもう少し待ってね。はい、どうぞよろしくお願いします。はい。
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have two technical questions and one general question.
Please.
So the first question is about the quotation by the paragraph which you quoted from maximum majority.
Yes.
And in this quotation, I think the word ratio appears. Right?
Yes, ratios.
The ratio. And so what is the Arabic in this passage, and what is the significance? It means that it's Pythagorean or philosophical or magical or mathematical or all together.
I would say mathematical, astrological, and the word in Arabic is nisba,
Oh, okay.
and it means configuration. So, you know, when you're constructing a talisman, you're not just addressing or looking at one planet, you're looking at different configuration relationships with planets. And this is what the celestial ratio is. And it is indeed a kind of mathematical ratio and an astronomical ratio and an astrological ratio.
Okay, because the term ratio is also important in philosophical text. So I thought maybe there's some kind of counteraction, but maybe it's only my imagination.
I think they're all interconnected because the language of magic, as I said, is not its own unique language. It's getting from natural philosophy and from metaphysics and from mathematics. And also there is a reference to Pythagoreanism. Although in the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, there's very little Pythagorean elements, but as I said, these were the sciences that apply all the other sciences like mathematics, philosophy, etc., etc.
The second question.
Please.
You mentioned Kitab al-Ruhaniyat, right? And I wondered what is the exact meaning of ila or illa, right? Is it causal influence or power or emanation?
I think it's the first, like you said. It's the causal powers of these ruhaniyat.
So there's no implication of something like influence or emanation.
Not in the Neoplatonic sense. In the sense here, it's often used to in describing Aristotelian causality, and sabab as well is another one. But in this text, in this context, I think it translates as the causal effects of the ruhaniyat.
Okay, because in Ismailiya, for example, illa means also influence or power or emanation. So I thought maybe...
Yes, yes. And if we want to talk more about the influence of the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, I've recently come across an Ismaili text which I found evidence of influence of the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica in the cyclical, because you know in Ismaili cosmology the cycles are important. So the influence of this you can even find in texts like Jafar Mansur Yaman as well. So.
And the final question, I'm sorry that I...
No. Please, go ahead.
And it's a very general question, but could you talk about sources for Arabic magic in general?
What's that?
Sources.
I don't know.
What are the sources?
The sources.
Sources for Arabic different Arabic magic.
So non-Arabic sources of Arabic magic.
How Greek or Gnostics or Hermetic magics influence on Arabic magic?
I think the sources that influenced Arabic magic the most explicit ones are astrological Greek works, I would say, and also understudied are Aramaic magic as well, Hebrew magic as well, and that requires, I think, much more study. And also, it's because astral magic, for example, really thrived during the translation movements, right? The Abbasid translation movement. And that's the time when medical material was being translated, astrological material was being translated, astronomical material. And that provided the theory that then a lot of occultists used to justify and understand the practices. As for the practices themselves, I think like the images, how things are done, not just the philosophy, I think it's more difficult to identify because I think there's a lot of local influence that are difficult to pinpoint, including, I would say, Mesopotamian practices, Indian practices, Byzantine practices, Egyptian practices. So, but the underlying theory and philosophy of magic comes from philosophical work, mathematical works, and medical works as well, and materia medica as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks so much. I'd like to ask about the type 5.
Type 5.
Yes. And it's quite interesting how the magical letters developed after the general period. But I'm just curious, you mentioned about magic squares. And it's actually the numbers. So in case of Agrippa, the numbers are independent genre or subject of the magic type of magic. So is it how magical letters, magical numbers are connected in your discussion?
So the magic square is not exclusively letterist or belongs to type 5. You see it in it's really ancient, right? It's like all the way from China. It's a very well established tradition. And in the Islamic context, you find letters as well. Like lettrism turned them more into letters than numbers. It seems that before it was more the numbers, and they had, I would say, less magical properties in the type 1. So in Ghayat al-Hakim, the Picatrix, you don't see magic squares. In the Suda Arstitian Hermetica, you don't see magic squares. Where they become really important is when the Sufis took them up and they gave them esoteric significances. And now, instead of just numbers, we have numbers and letters and divine names sometimes as well. So it's not exclusively related to letterist magic, but it became more evident as a magical practice during that time. But in other traditions of magic in the early medieval, you would find them as well, but not.
Thank you. I think it's maybe difficult to generalize, but as far as you know, you can maybe tell me. Those practitioners or even theorists, did they think doing something beyond the nature? Or they are working in the framework of nature?
In the type 1 and 2, it's within nature. And in fact, this is often emphasized. With the Islamicized Hermeticism, so what I refer to here as type 3, this is where, this is very interesting, because there's a term in Arabic called ghaib, the unseen, the realm that only God knows. It's very esoteric. You need to have your soul purified. So you have to undergo a lot of self-sublimation. You have to really live a quite an esoteric life to be able to gain access into the ghaib. You find that term missing. It's not there in the astral magic of the Ghayat al-Hakim or the or the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. But in the Islamicized Hermetic magic, yes, you start getting this reference of it, as I shown, that this is of religion, this is of shara. So this is of the ghaib, right? And the only people who can now practice magic are not natural philosophers, but mystics. Whereas astral magic and hermetic magic, what I refer to as hermetic magic, of course, there's always this understanding that to practice it, you need to have your intellect perfected, etc. You have to be wise, you have to be sage. But with the Islamicized and Sufic and Solomonic magic, it becomes more complicated. It becomes the magic of the elite, the spiritual elite. Whereas before, it was the natural philosophers who were practicing. So in a way, if you want, natural magic was more democratic. Whereas like the Islamicized type of magic, they become really the science, the gift that Sufis and mystics and the esoteric elite have, and this is a gift by God. And so an example I always like to give about exactly that tension is that an example of that is a letter that Ibn Arabi sent to Fakhruddin al-Razi. So Ibn Arabi wrote about the science of letters, of course, and was influenced by the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. But the principles of his magic are very much connected to the idea that you have to be a Sufi, you have to be an esoterically inclined person who has received the ability to practice magic not by intellect, but by a gift from God. So it's passively received. Fakhruddin al-Razi was somewhere between the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica and the Islamicized version. And he insisted that the place to get magic about the world, occult knowledge, is by intellect. So Ibn al-Arabi actually sends him a letter and tells him, hey, you are a great philosopher. I respect what you do, but this is not how you get occult knowledge. So there was this tension between natural philosophers on the one hand and esotericists like Sufis who insisted that these are skills that God gives you as a gift. Whereas Fakhruddin al-Razi is saying, no, this is knowledge that you inquire, it's inferred, it's an intellectual pursuit. So one is saying it's revelation, and one is saying it's by intellect. So there was this tension, and this is related to, things like nature versus supernatural, that nature can be known intellectually, but the unseen can only be known if God gives that gift to you, if you're pure enough.
I'd like to follow up.
Sure.
In that case, that later period, when more, Islamicized or Solomonic element comes, there was no worry from the side of religious authorities?
That's a very important question, a huge answer that I don't necessarily have all the elements of. The position of theologians on magic is not clear and it's not fixed. So you had groups. I mean, a lot of the people that we read or we mentioned today are theologians as well. But some theologians believe that all magic is forbidden because magic is referred to in the Quran, right? Sihr is mentioned in the Quran, and it's mentioned in a negative way. So the one of the most referred to verses of the Quran related to that is the verse that says that it was the angels Harut and Marut in Babylon that taught men magic. And it's in reference also to Solomon, that it was not Solomon who taught people magic, because it seems that a lot of people were saying that Solomon taught people magic. So the Quran is saying that no, it was not Solomon, it was the angels Harut and Marut, and this type of magic is bad because it separates man and wife, it's destructive. So on the basis of this and other verses of the Quran, you have some theologians who just categorically say magic should not be approached in any way, either by practice or just gaining knowledge. You have others that say magic is wrong, but you need to know it so you can counteract it. Others say, if it's not jinn and it's not demons, then it's fun. Others will go like, no, if it's intellectually and received as a gift by God, then it's okay. So it's not completely homogeneous, but also this is a subject that I don't think was dealt with systematically yet.
I have a question.
Please.
In relation to the Islamic theology, was there any logical aspects of, for example, salvation? Or
Like an eschatological, yeah.
Yes.
Yes. The Ghayat al-Hakim is called the goal of the sage. And the goal of the sage is ultimately salvation. And in Ghayat al-Hakim, that salvation comes through knowing the universe in its perfection. And one cannot create action at a distance, magical action at a distance, if the intellect is not perfected. And that, of course, has an eschatological meaning. In texts like Fakhruddin al-Razi, Sir al-Maktoum, not only salvation, and Yuki studies this, but also this idea of purifying oneself so that one becomes like a talisman, right? So what self-talismanization. And that's a term that Michael Noble came up with in his book on Fakhruddin al-Razi. And that also is like finding a perfect balance between body, soul, and mind, connected to the celestial spirit that he refers to as the perfect nature. And the perfect nature is a concept that came from the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. So the influence is always there. And the perfect nature is that part of yourself that is connected to the universe through your astrological sign and through your own stars. And it is, if one purifies themselves, and salvation is quite important in the ability to practice magic. To be a sage, to be a wise one, then you need to work on the soul.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
さあ、他に何か質問がありますか？はい、お願いします。
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And I'd like to ask you a question about the relationship between natural magic and geometrical astronomy.
Geometrical?
Astronomy. How did they refer to the geometrical astronomy? And if they did, what type of text did they read? Like, had some word on.
Can I ask specifically what you mean by geometrical astronomy?
I mean, the
mathematical.
Yes.
علم الهيئة. Got it. Yeah. As you might know, in the Islamicate context, astrology and astronomy were not separate. They were referred to as علم النجوم, which literally means the science of the stars. And that is divided into two categories that make up that science. One is quantitative, so dealing with mathematics and numbers and sizes, and that's what we refer to as astronomy. And the other one is qualitative, so it's the one that looks at the qualities of the influence of the stars, and that's what we refer to as astrology. Astrology is called علم أحكام النجوم, so the science of the judgments of the star. علم الهيئة can be translated as the science of the appearances of things, which means how we can experience those things by the sense, how we can measure them, the distances, their movement, basically how we can mathematicize the movements of the stars. But that separation that we know nowadays between astrology and astronomy did not exist. So astronomers and astrologers were two sides of the same coins. That is not to say that some astronomers did not agree with astrologers, right? But in general, they were the same science, ilm and nujum. Sources, other than the Greek sources, for example, Ptolemy, of course, and all of that, you have the works of Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi. And Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi is so important because 8th century, he was the first to systematize astrological practice and theory in a famous text called المدخل إلى علم أحكام النجوم, The Introduction to Astrology by Abu Ma'shar. And this is Abu Ma'shar providing that Aristotelian basis of astrology that I was talking to. So he wanted to explain and make a distinction between astrology and divination. So he says that divination is guesswork. It does not require proofs, whereas astrology, a theory can be provided for astrology. And so for him, the reason why astrology works is because the stars are the efficient causes of generation and corruption. Without, for form to unite with matter, you need an efficient cause, and that, according to Abu Ma'shar, is the stars. And therefore, everything in the world that is generated is essentially connected to the celestial world. And this is a great achievement, because on the basis of this theory, a lot of other astrologers and occultists base their theories in the Islamicate world and in Europe. And if you are interested in this book, it was translated into English by Professor Charles Burnett and the late Professor Yuji Yamamoto. And it's a brilliant edition, and it's quite a brilliant work. My book is mostly dealing with Abu Ma'shar and Bakr for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If please.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Saif. I have two questions. Both are the first one is, are there no manuscripts found whose contents agree with pseudo-Aristotelian Helvetica on the one hand, and that carry other names like Abaddon or Plato as their own?
So like the can you repeat that, please? Yeah.
There are no manuscripts found whose contents agree with pseudo-Aristotelian Helvetica on the one hand, and that carry other names like Abaddon, Plato, or ancient sages as their authors. Because this phenomenon are found when it comes to other Arabic Helvetica, right? And that's one of the main reasons we can define what is Hermeticism. That's at least what Kevin van Bleden argued.
Exactly. That's a very good point, in the sense that Hermeticism is not necessarily just Hermes, right? It's not just necessarily pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, which I agree with, but I think this argument runs short at a certain point, because if indeed our criteria for calling something Hermetic is just the name Hermes and just the name Aristotle, then that's not a substantial reason, indeed, to call something like that. But there seems to be a cluster of works that circulate the same idea. And for example, another works that are always included in the Arabic Hermetica, but not the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetics, for example, Apollonius of Tyana, Sir al-Khaliqa, for example. But Sir al-Khaliqa has, of course, the Emerald Tablet, the idea of as above, that the world above is connected to the world below, and it refers to Hermes in the crypt and finding the Emerald Table, so Hermes is there. But the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica in general, I would think it's much more complicated text than the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, because we have a Christian editor, and we have a Muslim scribe describing Hermetic material. So it's very Frankensteinian monster kind of text. The reference to Agathodaiman and the rest of the sages, we find them in, for example, the Ikhwan Safa, where in the episode 52a on magic, where when they want to describe the Greek tradition of magic that informed Islamic traditions, they mention these sages. But I think this is more about establishing a historical imaginary and more establishing lines of authorities, like isnad, if you want, like an occult isnad, hermetic isnad, as you want. And I think in a well thought out way, we can consider all of these texts as, what's the word, revolving around the core, that is the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. But I can't remember any other text attributed to Agatha Diamond that I think, for example, that I can think can be related to the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. The exception, I think, but it's also important to distinguish, is the Pseudo-Aristotelian Cyril Asrar, the Secretum Secretorum. There is no reference to Hermes in the same way as we see in the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. But it is connected in the sense that it is Pseudo-Aristotelian and it deals also with magic and physiognomy and divination in some parts. And I would call these related clusters, but not necessarily the core of the Hermetic material or Arabic Hermeticism.
Okay, thank you. And the second one is what you may have already explained, but I don't get what you mean. So, how far do you think can we expand the definition of your Hermeticism to the later phases of the history of Islam, Islamic Arabic magic? You mentioned Fakhruddin Razi. Is he an Arabic Hermetist according to your definition, or
Yes.
Neo Khansafa or Ahmad al-Buni?
Yeah.
Yes.
Ahmad al-Buni is more tricky because I wanted to look at some of the influences of the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica in Ahmad al-Buni, and I think it's more difficult to find than Fakhruddin al-Razi, who explicitly references the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. Because it's there. He refers to these things. So does Sikkaki. So it's easy to see that. But as I described, it's not a fixed tradition. It's a tradition that gets received and gets transformed according to the epistemological paradigms of legitimacy of that period. So in a way, via the Neo Ikhwan al-Safa and later, and we see that tradition evolving, but taking different clothes, so to speak. So I'm not so much interested in calling someone a Hermeticist, but I'm more interested in looking at a tradition of Arabic Hermetica in that sense. And it gets changed and it develops in the different context of its reception. And that leads to other questions. What happens to the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica in Europe? That's another subject that needs attention badly. What evidence do we have of the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica? We know that Professor Charles Burnett wrote an article about one of these texts in the works of Herman of Carinthia, the guy who in the 12th century translated Abu Ma'shar al-Badri. So it's all connected in a way, but requires more study. What happens to the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica perhaps in Al-Andalus as well? That's another transformation that we can look at. And there's evidence that in Al-Andalus there was some reception of the Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica as well. So it's not homogeneous. Again, it's different receptions in different ways. But I make it easier for myself by studying the Middle Ages. Thank you. You're welcome.
Any question?
Could you tell us a bit more about when you say Islamization, Islamization? I know, but is it some? So I would like to know much more about the definition of the word Islamization. So in what case you call it Islam or not? And because I'm working on the Western text, cosmology, which was translated to the early modern Japan. And in that case, it was translated in Japanese, and it's sometimes that some Chinese and Japanese elements were put into it. It is some technical terms are replaced by their own technical terms, not the original one, which is quite quite far from the original in many sense. But anyway, I just like to know do you have any general idea that in this case we can call it this is Islamicate, and in this case no, something like that, in your view?
That's an excellent question, which makes me admit that to use the term Islamicization is a little bit not stable, because you can arguably say, well, this material was always received by Muslims, so how is it un-Islamic then? Now, what I mean specifically by this is the explicit reference to the Quran in particular, and Quranic exegesis, and Islamic esoteric concepts. So, right, this is in general what I mean. So it becomes more related to the Quran. We start having elements that you find in the Quran, and you find in very confessional context. So the jinn. For example, in Ikhwan al-Safa and the Ghayat al-Hakim, they explicitly say that the ruhaniyat, these are not jinn, and we are not going to talk about this. Ghayat al-Hakim even says as much as the ruhaniyat are like the celestial agents, and the jinn are made of fire, and they're other entities that belong to the ghayb, the unseen. So the distinction is made very much so. I refer to Islamicization when we see these elements returned to the practice. So angels and jinn become very prominent. And then again, we start having references to the Quran all the time, and almost providing what I refer to as occult exegesis. So interpreting the Quran to justify occult practices. And basically the removal of elements that would be at the core un-Islamic, like a second creator, that was also removed, and the presence of the prophets, and the imams, and the letrist association is a Sufi tradition. And so that's what in general what I refer to as Islamicization of the Hermetic traditions. Although I put it between two brackets because it can be nuanced further for sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We can talk each other further, but we have reserved this class until 5 o'clock. So maybe we can finish the public lecture, and then we can talk each other more frankly.
Excellent.
Yeah. So we thank you for your public lecture.